He thought he was buying a burden. A broken-down horse too old for work, too frail for worth rescued, only out of pity, with the last crumpled bills in his pocket. But in the lonely silence of his ruined ranch, the animal began to watch him, as if it remembered things no living creature should. And when it pawed the earth to reveal the first fragment of a century-old mystery, the war-scarred veteran realized he hadn't purchased a dying beast. He had awakened a secret buried for generations, one that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The sun had barely cleared the ridge when Clearwater came alive. Dust rose in soft brown veils from the main street, stirred up by the shuffle of boots, the creak of wagon wheels, the snort of cattle being driven toward the square. The little town was nothing more than a scatter of false-fronted buildings, leaning saloons with swinging doors, a few weathered shops with fading paint, and the sheriff's office, whose sign had lost half its letters. Yet on auction day, it was loud, crowded, restless. The air smelled of boiled coffee and cheap tobacco, sweat, and manure, all mixed into the kind of pungent perfume only a livestock town could produce. Men leaned on the fences, chewing toothpicks or drawing long drags from rolled cigarettes. Women in sunbonnets held children by the hand, and their eyes bright with curiosity, though most had no money to bid. Boys darted through the crowd like stray dogs, weaving between boots, laughing and shoving. On the rough wooden platform at the center, the auctioneer's voice rose and fell in a steady rhythm, a chant that blended into the clatter of hooves and the call of handlers. Each lot of cattle was driven out, gaunt cows with ribs showing or stubborn steers tossing their heads at the rope. The bids were quick, rough, almost careless. Money changed hands with little thought for the flesh it was buying. Here and there were horses, some rangy mustangs captured out of the hills, still tossing and stamping their eyes wild with the memory of freedom. Others were young colts, barely halter broke, trembling as the crowd pressed in on them. The square echoed with jeers, whistles, the sharp slap of rope on hide. For most men here, the animals were nothing more than numbers poundage converted into dollars. The cruelty of it was not hidden. It was business plain and unvarnished. And into this clamor stepped Jack Callahan. He lingered at the edge of the crowd, tall but gaunt, his shoulders stooped beneath the weight of a faded army coat. The coat had once been olive green, but had long since bleached to a color between dust and ash. His boots were cracked, his hat stained with sweat, his jaw covered in a day's rough stubble. He looked out of place, too quiet for the noise, too still for the jostling tide of bodies. Some recognized him and nodded a half-hearted greeting. Others nudged one another and muttered, "That old soldier, back from the war with nothing, lives out in that shack of a ranch." A few laughed openly. Jack did not react. His gray eyes swept over the animals, then the people, as though measuring both with the same detached calm. He had not come to buy, he had no money worth speaking of. Curiosity had drawn him, or maybe habit. He had lived with silence so long that even the crude racket of an auction was a kind of relief. The chant of the auctioneer rolled on. Bids leapt up, fell away. Cattle were driven off and new lots brought in. Jack leaned a shoulder against a post, arms crossed, content to be ignored. Then the handlers brought out the horse. The animal was a ruin. Its back sagged, its ribs pushed stark against a dull hide, its steps slow and dragging. The mane hung in tangles. The tail barely swished at the flies that clung to its flanks. Scars marked its shoulders and hips, old wounds that told of harness or lash. Its eyes, clouded with age, blinked against the sunlight. The crowd laughed before the auctioneer even opened his mouth. "Hell, that one's ready for the glue factory. Put it on a wagon, maybe it'll make it down the street before it drops. Sell it by the pound, dog meat's worth more than that hide. The auctioneer did not bother with a smile. His gavel tapped the block with little enthusiasm. What'll you give me, gentlemen? Start at $5.05 to open. Do I hear 5? No hands lifted. 4 then, 3, 2. The handlers shifted, embarrassed. Dusty, the name was not yet spoken, but it clung to the animal like destiny stood motionless in the sun. It did not tremble as the younger colts had. It did not rear or shy. It only lowered its head, as if tired of the weight it had carried too long. And then, just for an instant, it lifted its gaze. From where he stood, Jack caught the look. The eyes were not blind. Clouded, yes, but behind the mist, there burned something that held him fast. Not despair, not resignation. Something else. A waiting patient and unyielding. He felt a stir in his chest, a memory rising unbidden. The war, the heat of sand and metal. A friend bleeding out beside him, staring with that same unspoken plea, "Don't leave me here." Jack's hand went to his pocket. He knew what was there, his last bill, folded and worn $50 that stood between him and an empty cupboard. It was meant for repairs on the roof, maybe a barrel of flour, maybe a doctor's visit if his chest pain returned. He told himself he could not afford sentiment. He told himself it was madness. But he could not look away from the horse. The auctioneer sighed. $1 then. Anyone take it off my hands. Jack's fist clenched around the bill. The laughter of the crowd buzzed in his ears. He heard his own voice before he meant to speak. $50. The square fell silent. Heads turned. Then the explosion of laughter. 50. You hear that? The old fool's lost his mind. $50 for a carcass on legs. Guess he wanted company in that shack of his. The auctioneer blinked, shrugged, and brought the gavel down with a crack. Sold. To the gentleman in the coat. $50. Jack stepped forward through the sea of jeers. He handed over the bill with steady fingers. His boots scuffed the dust as he crossed to the horse. Up close, the stench of neglect was heavy. He reached out a hand, slow, deliberate. The horse flinched once, a tremor through its frame, then stilled. Jack's palm rested against the scarred neck. The hide was warm, trembling faintly. The eyes met his again, clouded but not broken. Calm, as though some silent agreement had been made. The crowd lost interest, drifting back toward the pens where younger stock promised real profit. Jack remained with the horse, his hand firm on its neck. He did not smile, but the set of his jaw eased. Behind him, a voice drawled mocking. Ethan Crowley, broad-shouldered, well-fed, his hat tilted just so. A man who owned half the grazing land east of town and wanted the other half. Hell of a bargain you made, Callahan. $50 down the drain. You should have sold me that patch of dirt you live on instead. You'll have to sooner or later. Jack did not answer. He took the rope from the handler, gave it a tug, and began to walk. The horse followed, slow but steady hooves crunching in the dust. The road out of Clearwater was nothing more than a winding strip of dirt that shimmered under the noonday sun. Jack Callahan walked slowly, a coil of rope in one hand, the other resting against the faded brim of his hat as he tried to shield his eyes. The horse trailed beside him, without fuss, hooves sinking into the dust, each step steady and deliberate. The heat pressed down like a weight. Dust clung to Jack's boots, rising in red clouds, with every step staining the hem of his army coat. Behind him, the town still murmured children, shouting, a hammer striking against a post, the clatter of a truck shifting into gear. But out here, past the last row of buildings, it was only the wind and the rasp of breathing his and the horses. People lingered on porches to watch him pass. Some shook their heads in quiet pity, lips pursed As if the sight confirmed every rumor, the poor old soldier wasting what little he had left. Others smirked outright, lifting hands in mock salute or calling out words that carried just far enough to sting. Jack didn't answer. He had no energy left for pride. What struck him, though, was the horse. Dusty did not stumble or falter the way he had expected. The animal's body was thin, yes, ribs pushing sharp against the hide scars, etched like lines of an old map, but there was no trembling in the legs, no flinch at the distant growl of a truck, not even when a pack of farm dogs charged to the fence and barked furiously. The ears flicked once toward the sound and then settled forward again. The head stayed high, the stride even. Jack's brow furrowed. An old nag should have shied at every shadow, fought against the rope, or lagged half dead behind. Instead, this one moved with an odd, almost regal calm, its cloudy eyes fixed straight ahead as though it knew exactly where the road would take them. By the time the dust of Clearwater faded behind them, Jack found himself glancing at the horse more than the path. Something about its stillness unsettled him, though he would not have said why. Broken Spur Ranch sat at the end of a dry gulch hidden from the road until you were nearly upon it. Once decades ago, it had been a proud spread of land, white fences that gleamed in the sun, barns, painted red horses, in every paddock cattle across the ridges. Now it was a ruin. The iron gate leaned on its hinges, one side permanently jammed into the dirt. The sign above it, Broken Spur Ranch, was so rusted, the letters looked like scars more than words. Jack pushed it aside with his shoulder, the hinges screeching, and led Dusty through. What met them was silence broken only by the whisper of weeds. The yard was choked with grass that had gone wild stalks nearly up to Jack's knees. The wooden porch sagged on one side, boards warped by rain and years of neglect. The roof of the cabin had holes patched with tar paper patches that flapped in the wind. The barn was worse. Its doors hung open, one snapped clean off at the hinge, the other barely clinging. Inside, the air smelled of dust and rot. Cobwebs clung in the rafters, and the old tack racks drooped with leather straps gone stiff with mold. The water trough was dry, cracked at the bottom, and the feed bins were layered with nests of mice. Jack stopped in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust. His chest tightened with something between shame and resignation. He had told himself 100 times he would mend this place, but years had slipped by while he scraped for odd jobs, patched fences, and survived one day to the next. He turned to the horse. "Well," he muttered, voice low and rough, "it ain't much, but it'll have to do. Enough room for you to lay your bones down, at least." He fetched what he could. A bundle of dry straw left in the loft, brittle but usable. A bucket lowered into the well, and the rope squealing against the pulley water drawn up cool and faintly metallic. He dumped it into the trough, sloshing half across the dirt. His hands felt clumsy, as though he had forgotten the motions of care. He hadn't tended a horse in years. Dusty stepped inside the stall without protest. Jack unknotted the rope and stood back, expecting the animal to fold down onto its knees in exhaustion. Instead, it lifted its head ears, pricking forward, nostrils widening as though drawing in every scent. Jack leaned against the post, frowning. The horse did not rush to the water, nor bury its muzzle in the straw. It moved slowly, deliberately, circling the stall. Each hoof struck the ground with a measured thud. It nosed, the board sniffed at the rusted latch, pressed its shoulder against a post, as though testing its strength. At one point, it tapped the ground sharply with a forehoof, then listened, head cocked. Jack felt the hairs prickle along his neck. "What are you doing?" he muttered. The animal paused, ears swiveling toward a voice. For the briefest moment, their eyes locked. The light of afternoon caught in the depths, eyes he had thought clouded with age. Yet there was clarity there, startling and sharp like glass underwater. He could not look away. It was the strangest thing, the sense that the horse was studying him as carefully as he had studied it. Not the dull gaze of an animal, but something watchful, appraising, almost human. He shook his head unsettled and bent to scatter straw across the floor. "You're sharper than you look, old boy," he said gruffly. "Maybe sharper than me." The horse gave a low rumble in its chest, not quite a whinny, not quite a sigh. Jack froze, then let out a shaky laugh. "Now I'm hearing things. Lord help me." When he looked again, the sunlight slanting through the broken boards caught the horse's eyes, and for an instant, just an instant, they looked clear. Not aged, not dim, but bright, reflecting a depth that felt impossibly old. Memories seemed to live there, not as not any man's, but something carried across the years he could not name. The moment passed. The horse lowered its head, nudging at the straw. Jack turned away, uneasy in a way he could not put into words. The growl of an engine broke the silence. Jack stepped out of the barn to see a pickup truck roll to a stop at the fence line. Shiny knew its paint still clean despite the dust of the road. Ethan Crowley leaned out the open window, sunglasses flashing in the sun, a smile stretched thin across his face. "Well, well," Ethan drawled, killing the engine and climbing down. He propped an elbow on the truck door and looked across the yard. "Thought I'd come see for myself. Word in town is you bought yourself a miracle today." Jack said nothing, only went back to dragging a forkful of old straw toward the barn. Ethan's laugh carried sharp and mocking. "Look at you. $50 for that bag of bones. You must really be losing it, old man. That horse isn't worth the lead it'd take to put it down." Jack kept his eyes on his work jaw tight. Ethan strolled a little closer, boots crunching the gravel. "You know what you should have done. Sold me this place. I've made the offer more than once. You could have walked away with something in your pocket instead of wasting what's left of your pension on a dying nag." Jack straightened at last. His face was lined, his hair shot through with gray, but his eyes were steady. He met Ethan's stare across the fence. "This ranch isn't for sale." For a second, Ethan's grin faltered, then returned sharper than before. He gave a mocking shake of his head. "Stubborn old fool. The land will be mine soon enough, whether you want it or not." He climbed back into his truck, gunned the engine, and let a plume of dust roll across the yard as he pulled away. The sound faded into the hills, leaving silence behind. Jack set the fork aside and lowered himself onto the step outside the barn. His knees ached, his back throbbed, but the weight of Ethan's words pressed heavier than either. He stared at the ground a long while and then turned toward the stall. Dusty stood waiting calm as before. Jack filled a smaller bucket, carried it in, and set it down. The horse lowered its head, drinking slow, measured gulps. Jack rested against the post, watching. "You and me," he said quietly. "We're both seen as useless. Cast-offs. Folks think our best days are behind us." The horse paused, water dripping from its muzzle, and lifted its head to look at him. The gaze was direct, unwavering. Jack let out a long breath. "But maybe we still have something left." For a moment, the stall was utterly still, bathed in the orange glow of late afternoon. Dust motes drifted like slow stars in the light. Then Dusty took a single step forward until the distance between man and horse was no more than an arm's length. Jack reached out, hand resting lightly against the scarred hide. The warmth of life pulsed beneath his palm. The horse did not move away. And in that silence, something settled between them. Not trust, not yet, but the fragile beginning of it. The dawn came slow over the hills of Wyoming, spilling gold light across the brittle grass. The ridges glowed, first sharp lines softened by haze, and then the valley caught fire with colors straw yellow, pale orange, the faint pink of a sky not yet fully awake. The air was still cool, though the day promised heat. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance, answered by another fainter from a neighboring ranch. The only other sound was the low whistle of wind weaving through the broken slats of the fence. Jack Callahan stepped onto the porch with a chipped enamel cup in his hand. The coffee inside was black and bitter, boiled too long, but it was hot, and that was enough. He wore the same jacket he always did, faded olive drab, the cuffs fraying, pulled around him against the morning chill. His boots scuffed across the porch, raising small clouds of dust from boards that should have been swept months ago. He paused at the top of the steps, eyes roaming across his yard. The place was still a wreck. Weeds up past his knees, the barn sagging, the fences bowed like tired backs. He had a half-dozen chores he kept telling himself he would get to. Today he promised he would at least start. Maybe patch a hole in the fence, maybe clear out the water trough. But his gaze shifted before he could decide. Dusty stood at the far corner of the corral. The horse's head was lowered, shoulders squared, not the drooping, weary posture Jack expected. It wasn't grazing either. It was fixed, intent pawing at the ground in short, deliberate strikes. The sound carried faintly, even across the yard hoof against hard soil, steady, rhythmic. Jack frowned into his cup. "What the hell are you up to?" he muttered. At first he ignored it. Horses pawed the ground all the time, impatience, nerves, boredom. But when he walked closer, Dusty didn't stop. The old gelding's hoof came down with surprising force, over and over, scattering clumps of dirt. The animal wasn't restless. Its ears stayed forward, eyes locked on the ground, like it meant to dig to the other side of the world. Jack leaned on the fence, scowling. "You trying to knock my fence down? Cut it out, you old fool." Dusty didn't so much as flick an ear at him. The hoof struck again, gouging a deeper groove. Jack let out a growl of irritation, set his coffee on a post, and trudged into the corral. "All right," he said, grabbing the horse's halter and tugging lightly. "That's enough." But Dusty refused to move. The muscles in its neck tightened, resisting just enough to hold its ground. Then, as if to make a point, it struck the dirt again, harder this time. Jack cursed under his breath. "Fine, you win." He went back to the porch, fetched a spade from the wall, and returned. "Let's see what you think is so damn important." He knelt where the horse had dug and drove the spade into the earth. The ground was dry, stubborn. He dug a few inches, then a few more, sweat already beading on his forehead. The horse stood over him the whole time, eyes steady, breath slow. Something clicked against metal. Jack froze. He brushed dirt aside with his hand, fingers closing on a small, round object. He lifted it out into the light. A button. Brass mottled green with corrosion, the eagle insignia still faintly visible on its face. A military button, 19th century, if he wasn't mistaken. Jack stared, the breath caught in his throat. He had no idea how long it had lain buried, but the weight of it in his palm felt heavy, significant. He turned to the horse. Dusty blew through its nostrils a short, sharp sound and fixed him with that steady gaze again. Jack swallowed. "You've got to be kidding me." He told himself it was nothing. A coincidence. Land out here was old ranches, built on top of ranches, trails where soldiers once rode. Maybe the ground had shifted and the button had worked its way close to the surface. Maybe Dusty just happened to scratch at the right spot. But he couldn't shake the image of the horse standing over him, waiting, almost expectant. And then it happened again. A few mornings later, Jack found Dusty pawing at another patch of dirt, this time near the far fence line. He nearly ignored it, but curiosity gnawed. With a muttered curse at himself, he fetched the spade again. The ground yielded something small, square, and gleaming dull in the light, a brass buckle initials stamped faint but clear. Jack brushed the dirt away with trembling fingers. He had seen plenty of old buckles, but this one was no farmhand's. It was military 19th century issue. Dusty stood silent, ears pricked. Jack's heart thudded. The next day, the same thing. Another corner of the yard, another round of pawing. Jack dug sweat dripping from his nose and turned up a silver coin. Tarnished, but the date was legible, 1875. He sat back hard on his heels, staring at it in his palm. "God Almighty," he whispered. The horse snorted softly, almost like an answer. By the fourth time, Jack wasn't even pretending to resist. He followed the horse across the corral, shovel in hand, waiting. Dusty pawed once, twice, then stood still as though marking the spot. Jack dug. Out came a jagged shard of metal, part of a blade, maybe a saber, maybe a stirrup. He laid it on the dirt beside the other's chest, heaving. Dusty lowered its head, exhaled through its nose, and stared. Jack could no longer call it coincidence. That night, he carried everything inside. The button, the buckle, the coin, the shard. He set them on the scarred wooden table in his kitchen, one by one, arranging them like puzzle pieces. The lamplight gleamed across their surfaces, catching every nick and scratch, every line of age. He sat in his chair, hands clasped tight, staring. Each object alone could be dismissed as junk. Lost trinket scraps from an old camp, things left behind by travelers a century ago. But together, they felt like something else, like pieces of a story that had been waiting in the ground all this time. Jack picked up the button again, turning it over in his calloused fingers. His gut clenched with a strange mixture of awe and unease. "How the hell?" he whispered. He thought of war dogs he had seen overseas, trained to sniff explosives, bodies, even weapons buried deep. But this wasn't a dog. And Dusty wasn't sniffing. He was choosing precise, deliberate. Jack pressed a hand to his forehead. "Christ, I'm losing it." But the memory of the horse's eyes stayed with him, calm, ancient, knowing. Not an animal's eyes, not entirely. The night pressed in quiet around him. He poured himself a finger of whiskey, drank it down, and set the glass aside. He told himself he was imagining things, that the war, the years of loneliness, the endless silence of the ranch had finally gotten to him. And then he heard the soft scrape of hooves outside. Jack rose, heart thudding, and went to the window. Dusty stood just beyond the porch, head lifted, eyes reflecting the lamplight. The horse gave a soft nicker, almost gentle, then turned its head toward the table where the artifacts lay. Jack froze. For a moment, he could have sworn the animal was urging him onward. By morning, he made his decision. He packed the objects into a canvas bag, tying the mouth tight. He slung it over his shoulder and stepped outside, squinting into the pale dawn. Dusty stood waiting near the fence ears, forward, body still. Jack looked at him a long time, jaw clenched. Then he muttered, "If you want me to understand, then fine, I'll listen." The horse flicked its ears once, as if satisfied. Jack turned down the path toward Clearwater Bag, heavy at his side. He was headed for the one place where questions like these might find answers, the library. And though he did not say it aloud, one thought echoed in his mind. This was no ordinary horse. Clearwater's library stood near the edge of Main Street, a relic of another age. The building was all red brick and narrow windows, with arched doorways framed in pale sandstone. It looked like something lifted out of a photograph from the early 1900s, stubbornly clinging to dignity, while the rest of the town rusted and shifted around it. Jack parked at the curb and stepped out, the bag bumping against his leg. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, answers, maybe, though he didn't believe in them anymore. Not for his life, not for the country, and certainly not for a handful of buried trinkets. But he couldn't stop himself. The wooden doors creaked when he pushed them open. Inside, the air was cool, musty, carrying the scent of paper and dust. Rows of shelves stood like tired soldiers, their spines faded, many sagging with neglect. Sunlight slanted through tall stained glass windows, coloring the floor in fragments of blue, red, and green. It was quiet. The kind of silence Jack wasn't used to, so different from the brittle stillness of the ranch. This was a silence made of patience, the hush of words waiting for someone to read them again. He cleared his throat softly and stepped further in. He had never been one for books. A soldier's life had taught him to read maps, orders, labels on ammunition crates, not much more. He felt clumsy here, like a trespasser in someone else's world. Behind the main desk sat a woman with silver hair, tied in a bun, spectacles perched low on her nose. She looked up as he approached, and recognition sparked in her sharp blue eyes. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice calm, measured. "It's been a long time since you set foot in here." Jack shifted his weight. "Helen." He nodded, clearing his throat. Didn't think anyone would remember. Helen Moore smiled faintly. She had the air of someone who missed nothing, who carried the town's memory inside her head like a carefully cataloged shelf. "Not much escapes me. You're hard to forget." Jack scratched at his jaw, suddenly awkward. "I need your help. With something." He placed the canvas bag on the desk, untied the knot, and tipped the contents out one by one. The brass button rolled slightly before settling. The buckle clinked against the coin. The shard of metal rang dull on the wood. Helen's eyes widened, the calm mask slipping for just an instant. She reached for the button first, lifting it delicately as though it might crumble in her hand. Her fingers traced the eagle insignia. "Where did you get these?" she asked, her voice sharper now. Jack hesitated. He wasn't about to explain that his half-dead horse had pawed them out of the ground with uncanny precision. "Found them around the ranch," he said finally, "buried in the dirt." Helen studied him, clearly not convinced, but she didn't press. Instead, she picked up the buckle, turned it over, and inhaled softly. "These aren't just scraps, Mr. Callahan." Her voice carried a kind of reverence now. She held the buckle toward the window, letting the weak sunlight catch the engraved letters. 7th Cavalry. That would place it, yes, post-Civil War, most likely the 1870s. She set it down carefully and reached for the coin. Her thumb rubbed away a smear of dirt until the year revealed itself, 1875. Jack leaned closer. That old Helen nodded. Silver dollar minted in Philadelphia. They don't just appear in Wyoming dirt without a reason. Finally, she lifted the broken shard. Her brow furrowed, lips tightening as she studied the faint etching along the edge. "This looks like a fragment of a cavalry saber, issued standard in that era." Her hands moved methodically, reverent and precise, as though she were piecing together a puzzle she had seen before. When she set the shard down, her gaze shifted back to him. "You know what all of this points to, don't you?" she asked. Jack shook his head slowly. "I'm just seeing junk?" Helen leaned back, folding her hands. "Marcus Thornfield." Jack frowned. "Who?" Her eyes lit with that particular spark only librarians seem to carry, the thrill of an old story finding breath again. She rose, motioned for him to follow, and led him through the aisles. Dust swirled in her wake. She stopped at a shelf in the far corner, reached high and drew down a leather-bound volume thick with age. She opened it on a table, pages crackling, and tapped a photograph, sepia-toned faded. A man in uniform, stern jaw, proud eyes. The caption beneath read, Captain Marcus Thornfield, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1876. Helen's voice softened. His unit disappeared near Clearwater 150 years ago. They were transporting government gold to Fort Laramie. Neither the men nor the shipment was ever seen again. Jack bent over the page, scanning the brittle words. Disappeared out here. Yes. Helen turned more pages, showing him a hand-drawn map with crude markings of mesas, valleys, ridgelines. Official records claimed they were ambushed by Cheyenne raiders, but her eyes narrowed. No bodies, no horses, no weapons, not a trace, only rumors. Jack felt a chill despite the warm afternoon light. And the gold gone. She shut the book gently, palms pressing the cover. Treasure hunters have been chasing it for over a century. Some swore they found signs, but no one ever uncovered proof. It became one of Wyoming's oldest legends. Jack shifted, uneasy. So you're saying? These things. He gestured toward the button, the buckle, the coin, the shard. They're from his unit. Helen nodded slowly. Every piece fits. Uniform button, cavalry buckle, saber fragment, silver coin of the era. All from the right year, and all here in your soil. Jack exhaled long and low. His mind flickered with images, Dusty scraping the earth, standing silent, watching. He hadn't told her that part. He wasn't ready to. Helen's voice dropped lower, almost conspiratorial. Some say the land itself is cursed. Every man who chased Thornfield's gold met bad ends, ruin, madness, death. Others claim the captain betrayed his own men. Some whisper the cavalry never died at all, only vanished into the mesas. She met his eyes across the table. But what no one has ever explained is why nothing was ever found. Not one body, not one weapon. Until now, the library seemed colder suddenly. Jack rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. Helen's tone softened again, the stern edge easing into something like curiosity. Mr. Callahan, if you find more anything at all, you should bring it to me. These could be the first real clues in 150 years. Jack's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. He wanted to laugh it off, to tell her she was making more of it than it was. But the weight of the canvas bag argued otherwise. He closed it again, tying the knot. When he lifted it, it felt heavier than when he had arrived, as though the stories she had poured into it had soaked into the fabric. Yeah, he said quietly. Maybe I will. Helen gave a small nod, satisfied. Jack turned his boots, echoing softly across the old wooden floor. The colored light from the stained glass fell across his shoulders like fragments of another world. When he stepped back into the fading sunlight of Main Street, the bag thumped against his side, each artifact clinking faintly inside. For the first time, he wondered if they were not relics at all, but keys. Keys to a door he hadn't known existed. One Dusty seemed intent on leading him through. The sun had already dipped low by the time Jack Callahan returned from Clearwater. The library's dusty stillness clung to him, the echo of Helen Moore's voice circling his mind like a restless hawk. Captain Marcus Thornfield. Vanished. 150 years ago. If you found these, you may be holding the first real clue. He parked the truck by the crooked gate of Broken Spur Ranch, climbed out, and stood for a long moment in the brittle light of evening. The ranch looked as it always did, fences tilting like old bones weeds waving in the dry wind. The barn a tired shadow against the hills. But Jack no longer saw it the same way. Every board, every stone seemed touched now by the weight of history. His land wasn't just a failing ranch. It might be the graveyard of secrets. And there, by the fence, stood Dusty. The horse lifted his head as Jack approached, ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring softly. Those clouded eyes, too sharp, too alive for a beast his age, fixed on him with quiet insistence. Jack exhaled a humorless chuckle scraping from his chest. "What the hell are you, old boy?" Dusty blinked, then lowered his head as though bowing in invitation. Jack felt the strangest thought surface in his mind, an urge he hadn't known in years. Ride him. It had been decades since he'd last sat a saddle. After the war, horses had become relics in his life, like medals gathering dust in drawers. His body wasn't the same either. His back ached most mornings, his knees stiff from old shrapnel and weather. Mounting a horse now seemed almost laughable. But he couldn't shake it. The name Thornfield the button. And the coin, all of it buzzed in his skull. And here was Dusty waiting. "Damn fool idea," Jack muttered, but his hands were already reaching for the old saddle stored in the barn. The leather creaked under his touch, dry and cracked, but serviceable. He hadn't bothered to oil it in years, never thinking he'd use it again. When he brought it out, Dusty didn't shy or flinch. He stood rock steady, lowering his head, while Jack cinched the straps. Jack's fingers fumbled with the buckles, clumsy with disuse. "All right," he murmured, "don't you go breaking my hip." He braced, swung his leg up slow, stiff, ungainly. To his surprise, Dusty didn't sag beneath the weight or stumble as Jack settled into the seat. Instead, the horse squared his stance, lifted his head, and shifted like a seasoned war mount, carrying its rider into formation. Jack froze, gripping the saddle horn. This wasn't how an old nag behaved. Not by a long shot. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "You've done this before." At first, he only meant to walk the perimeter of the ranch. The sun was setting, painting the dry fields in shades of rust and amber. Dusty moved with a measured gait, smooth despite his ragged appearance, hooves finding solid ground, as though by memory. Jack relaxed slightly, letting the rhythm seep into him. But then Dusty changed course. Without hesitation, the horse turned from the fence line and headed straight for the broken gate that led west. "Hey now," Jack said, tugging gently on the reins. "That's far enough. We're staying close tonight." Dusty ignored the cue. Not with stubbornness, there was no fight in him. Instead, he simply kept walking steady and sure, as though Jack's pull was no more than a passing breeze. Jack frowned, pulling harder. Dusty slowed for a moment, then continued unhurried but relentless, his hooves tracing an old trail Jack hadn't walked in years. "You son of a..." Jack sighed. He considered dismounting, but something in the horse's quiet confidence stayed him. "All right then. Show me." The trail wound into the western hills, where red sandstone bluffs rose like weathered ramparts against the fading sky. The air cooled, scented with sage and dust. Jack recognized parts of the land places he had ridden as a boy before the war, before the ranch had fallen into ruin. But Dusty walked with purpose, as though retracing steps far older than Jack's memory. They passed brittle clumps of cactus, their shadows long and spidery in the evening light. A hawk wheeled overhead, its cry echoing off the rocks. The ground grew rougher, scattered with loose shale and scrub brush. Jack's unease deepened. "You sure about this, old man? You're running on borrowed time already. What if you drop dead out here?" Dusty's ears flicked, but he never faltered. His stride carried them deeper toward the looming walls of stone, where the land grew silent, untouched by the noise of town or ranch. The further they went, the more Jack felt it, that strange pull in his chest. Part dread, part compulsion. As though he were following not a horse, but a summons. An hour later, The trail opened suddenly into a wide, flat basin hidden among the cliffs. Jack pulled up short, breath-catching. It wasn't a pasture, not a valley. It was something in between a mesa hemmed in by towering rock, invisible until you stood inside it. The place carried an uncanny hush, broken only by the whine of wind threading through narrow cracks. He swung down from the saddle boots, crunching on dry earth. Dusty remained still, lifting his head, high nostrils flaring as if scenting the ghosts of a long-lost camp. Jack turned slowly, eyes adjusting. The land was scarred with faint traces shapes that didn't belong to mere geology. There in the dirt, a ring of stones blackened by old fire ash hardened into crust. Nearby, the skeletal frame of timber posts, half-rotted, leaning as though once supporting canvas. Empty cans rusted into the soil. Shards of green glass gleamed faintly, remnants of bottles long shattered. Jack crouched, touching the blackened stones. They crumbled at his fingers. He brushed the dirt away from a rusted tin, the label long gone. It was a camp. A soldier's camp by the look of it. Forgotten, abandoned, but not erased. He straightened slowly, chest tightening. This was theirs. Dusty stamped a hoof, sending up a puff of dust. His ears pointed forward, body tense as though standing inspection. Jack wandered further, drawn to the sheer wall of stone on the north side of the mesa. His boots scuffed against gravel until he spotted it, something carved into the face of the rock, worn smooth by wind and time. He stepped closer, brushing dirt and lichen away with his palm. The evening sun struck at the right angle, filling the grooves with shadow. Letters, MT 1876. Jack's breath hitched. His heart hammered so loud it echoed in his ears. Marcus Thornfield. His voice rasped the name like a curse and a prayer all at once. He traced the letters with trembling fingers. The year was exact. The initials unmistakable. Proof carved in stone that the captain had stood right here, perhaps on the last day of his life. Jack staggered back, staring. The story Helen had told, the rumors, the vanished regiment, suddenly they weren't just tales in dusty books. They were carved into the bones of the land itself. Behind him, Dusty gave a soft whinny. Jack turned, meeting the horse's gaze. For one impossible instant, he swore the animal understood. The mesa pressed down with its silence. Jack's skin prickled. The sun was falling fast now, the shadows lengthening. 150 years ago, men had lived, laughed, maybe died on this ground. And now he stood among their traces, the only living witness guided here by a horse too old to walk, yet strong enough to carry him straight into history. He shook himself, gathering the reins. "We're leaving," he muttered, voice rough. "Before I lose my damn mind." Mounting again, he turned Dusty toward the narrow trail out. The horse obeyed this time, steady as ever, carrying him back through the red rock canyons. The sky deepened into purple, the first stars flickering. Jack's thoughts spun in endless circles, colliding with one another. "Why me?" he whispered into the wind. "Why show me this?" Dusty's ears twitched, but he kept walking, unhurried, certain. His hooves struck the earth with the weight of purpose. Jack closed his eyes briefly, feeling the rhythm beneath him. He didn't know the answers. But one thing was certain now: he was being led somewhere, whether he wanted it or not. And Dusty wasn't finished yet. The afternoon sun burned low across the Wyoming sky, its light gilding the dust and rust that clung to every board of Broken Spur Ranch. Jack Callahan was bent over the western fence line, hammering a warped board back into place. Sweat traced down his spine, and the hammer in his hand thudded in rhythm with his thoughts, sharp, restless, uneasy. He had barely slept since finding Thornfield's initials carved into stone. Each night he laid the relics on the kitchen table, the button, the coin, the broken shard of sword, and stared at them as though they might whisper their secrets if he looked long enough. The weight of them pressed on him like a second war he hadn't signed up for. The steady creak of his fence work was interrupted by a distant rumble. Tires on gravel. Jack paused, squinting toward the road. A battered pickup truck rolled to a halt at the gate, the dust settling in the dry air like powder smoke after a volley. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, angular, his frame almost delicate in its leanness. He wore a gray jacket over pressed slacks that didn't belong in ranch country, and a pair of glasses glinted in the sun. His stride was measured, his smile polite, but his eyes, quick, sharp behind the lenses, missed nothing. Jack leaned on the fence post hammer, dangling from his hand. "Mr. Callahan," the stranger asked, voice mild, almost careful. "Jack Callahan of Broken Spur Ranch. That's me." Jack replied slowly. The man nodded, approaching just enough to be heard without shouting. "Dr. Samuel Tran. I teach archaeology at the University of Denver. I wonder if I might borrow a few minutes of your time." Jack's jaw tightened. About what Tran's gaze flicked briefly toward the yard, and then to the barn, then back to Jack. "I've heard you may have come across some items of historical interest." Possibly dating to the 1870s, Jack's stomach dropped like a stone. He hadn't told a soul except Helen Moore at the library. Not even Ethan Crowley knew. "Where'd you hear that?" His tone came out harder than intended. Tran raised both hands slightly, palms open. Small towns have long memories and fast whispers. A colleague of mine passed along the story. "Forgive me for intruding, but if the rumors are true, your land could hold one of the great unsolved mysteries of the American West. The disappearance of Captain Marcus Thornfield's unit, 1876. The name struck Jack like a hammer to the chest. Thornfield again, already at his doorstep. Tran reached into his coat, produced a business card, and held it between two fingers. "All I ask is permission to survey. A formal excavation, with respect for your property, and of course, with you credited for the discovery. If your land holds evidence of the 7th Cavalry Detachment, it could change the historical record." Jack stared at the card, but didn't take it. His voice was low. "I'll think about it. But until then, this is private land. Nobody comes digging without my say-so." Tran inclined his head, unfazed. "Understood. That's fair." He set the card on the fence post and stepped back. "If you reconsider, call me. Day or night." He offered a final polite smile, climbed back into his dust-caked truck, and drove off, leaving only the fading growl of his engine and a plume of grit hanging in the air. Jack watched until the truck disappeared. Then he picked up the card, white embossed neat. Samuel Tran, P.D., Department of Anthropology, University of Denver. The letters seemed to burn against his fingers. Inside the kitchen, Jack placed the card on the table beside the relics. The button and the coin glinted in the lamplight like eyes staring back at him. Helen's voice echoed in his memory. "Some will come looking, and they'll stop at nothing." He rubbed his temples, exhaustion dragging at his bones. It had taken only days. Days since he dug the first scrap of metal from the earth, and already strangers were arriving at his gate with soft words and sharper eyes. Through the window, Dusty stood by the corral fence, watching the house with an intensity that unsettled Jack. The horse's ears swiveled, nostrils flaring as though he too could smell the shift in the wind. "Yeah," Jack muttered, staring out at him. Something's wrong. For the first time, the secret no longer felt like his alone. That night, after patching the last fence and forcing down a supper of beans and stale bread, Jack lit the oil lamp in his living room. The ranch was quiet, except for the wind rattling the barn door. He leaned back in his chair, trying to shake the unease gnawing at him. Then came the sound of tires again. Slow this time, deliberate, gravel crunching under heavy wheels. Jack stiffened. A black sedan rolled to a halt outside, sleek and polished out of place in the dust of Clearwater. Two men stepped out, both in dark suits, ties, knotted tight sunglasses still on despite the nightfall. Their movements were precise, controlled. Jack set the lamp down and opened the door before they could knock. "Evening," he said flatly. The taller of the two produced a wallet with a badge that flashed briefly in the lamplight. Too briefly for Jack to read. Mr. Callahan, Agents Morrison and Kane. Federal Bureau of Investigation. His tone was smooth, but his eyes were cold. Jack crossed his arms. "FBI out here?" "What for?" The second man, Kane, stepped forward slightly. His face was harder, the lines sharper, his voice quieter but edged with steel. "We understand you've come into possession of government property, military artifacts, potentially sensitive in nature." Jack's grip tightened on the door frame. "And how the hell would you know that Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes?" "We know a great many things, Mr. Callahan. Enough to advise you this isn't a matter for private collectors or small-town gossip. This is national interest. You'll hand them over." Jack barked a bitter laugh. "I haven't signed or said a damn thing. And unless you've got paperwork, you don't set foot past that gate." Morrison leaned closer, dropping the smile. His voice dropped with it. "Don't be foolish. You're a washed-up veteran living on borrowed land. Nobody would miss you if you vanished. Cooperate and you'll be remembered as the man who helped preserve history. Resist." He let the silence finish the sentence. Behind him, Kane had turned slightly, his attention drawn to the corral. Dusty stood rigid in the moonlight, ears pinned, muscles taut beneath his weathered hide. Kane smirked faintly. "Strange animal," he murmured. "Old as dirt, but there's something in his eyes. Almost like he knows more than he should." Jack's fists clenched. Every instinct told him these men weren't FBI. Their suits were wrong, their approach too sharp, their threat too blunt. He'd seen their kind before in alleys and war zones in the shadows of governments. Mercenaries wrapped in false authority. He forced his voice steady. "This conversation's over. Get off my land." Morrison held his stare for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "We'll be in touch." The two men turned, climbed back into their car, and drove off without hurry, their headlights cutting a pale scar through the night, until they vanished over the ridge. Jack stood at the door long after the sound faded. His chest burned with the old familiar heat of anger, the kind that used to carry him through firefights. But beneath it lay something colder dread. The relics weren't just historical curiosities anymore. They were bait, and he had swallowed it whole. He shut the door and turned slowly. Dusty was still at the fence, silvered by moonlight, watching him. The horse's eyes gleamed with a light that seemed unearthly, unbroken by time. Jack whispered into the silence. "Looks like the fight's come to us, old man." Dusty shifted, stamping once, then gave a sharp, ringing whinny that cut through the night air. It was not the sound of fear. It was challenge, defiance. Jack's lips tightened into a grim line. He moved to the table, gathered the relics into the cloth bag, and tied the knot tight. "If they want it," he muttered, "then I'll damn well find it first." The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind rose, carrying Dusty's voice across the empty fields, a call that felt less like an animal's cry than the opening note of a battle yet to come. The morning after the so-called agents came to his door, Jack Callahan knew sleep would never again bring him peace. He had lain awake long into the night, replaying their threats, their cold stares, the smirk one of them gave Dusty. Men like that didn't bluff. They would be back, and next time they wouldn't bother with polite warnings. Jack had learned a hard lesson overseas: when danger comes sniffing around you, don't wait for it to find you in your bed. You move first. So at first light, he set about preparing. He gathered what little gear he owned: a spade with a cracked handle, a length of old rope, a canvas satchel to carry anything worth saving. He oiled the hinges of a rust-spotted lantern and checked the small Colt revolver he kept in a drawer. 6 rounds left, all of them older than the president. He slipped them into the cylinder anyway. When he stepped outside, the air was sharp with morning chill, though the sun was already brightening the ridges to the west. Dusty stood waiting by the fence line. The horse's ears twitched toward him as if he'd been standing guard through the night. Jack muttered, "You knew I'd decide this, didn't you?" Dusty gave no answer, of course. But when Jack swung the rope loosely around his neck and patted his flank, the horse stepped forward with a readiness that made it feel less like obedience and more like partnership. Together, they set off into the hills. The trail wound higher into the sandstone ridges, where only coyote prints disturbed the dust. The further they rode, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed to hush, leaving only the rasp of wind through thorn brush. By mid-morning, the hidden mesa rose before them, again flat-topped, walled in by cliffs, like a fortress of stone. Jack reined Dusty to a halt and surveyed the empty land. The place seemed to breathe secrets. He felt like he was walking into a graveyard where the dead still listened. Dusty's head lifted, nostrils flaring. Then, without prompting, he stepped off toward the same patch of level earth he had pawed at days before. His hooves struck the soil with 3 deliberate stamps, as though marking the spot. "All right," Jack muttered, sliding off the saddle. "Let's see what you've been trying to show me." The ground was baked hard, resistant, but Jack had dug fighting positions in worse. He pressed the spade down with his boot, levering up clods of dirt. Each thrust was harder than the last. The earth clung to its secret like a clenched fist. Dusty stayed nearby, ears flicking, tail twitching, watching each motion. It was absurd, but Jack felt like the horse was timing his breaths to Jack's own. Minutes turned to an hour. Sweat plastered his shirt to his back. His arms burned, his breath came ragged. Just as he considered resting, the blade struck something hollow. A sharp thud different from stone. Jack froze, heart hammering. Carefully, he scraped away the dirt until the outline emerged. Wood ancient and splintering, half-rotted, but unmistakably a chest. "God almighty," Jack whispered. He crouched, brushing dirt from a corroded lock. The iron flaked beneath his fingers, the wood soft as sponge in places. But the shape was clear, a military supply crate, the kind he'd seen in old war museums. He sat back on his heels, breath trembling. 150 years in the ground, waiting. Dusty let out a low, rumbling whicker. Jack looked up at him. "Yeah," he said softly. "I hear you. Let's open it." He drew his pocket knife, wedged the blade beneath the rusted latch, and pried. The lock gave way with a brittle snap. Slowly, he lifted the lid. A rush of stale, mold-sweet air escaped, heavy with age. Inside lay objects that glowed even through the dust of centuries. The first thing Jack saw was gold. Small leather pouches, their seams, stiff but intact, spilled open to reveal nuggets, flecks, and the dull, rich shine of dusted ore. Beneath them, nestled like treasure in a pirate's chest, sat 2 gleaming bars of minted gold, their edges sharp despite tarnish. Jack swallowed, throat dry. It was more wealth than he'd seen in his life, and yet his hands didn't reach for it. Because what lay beside the gold froze him colder than winter water. Jewelry, silver cuffs etched with tribal patterns, a necklace of turquoise and carved bone. A pouch of beads, each one shaped by hand, each one a voice from a culture Jack knew had been bled and buried under history's boots. They hadn't just carried government gold. They'd carried plunder, spoils stripped from native people tucked into the same chest as military treasure. Jack's chest tightened. He whispered, "Jesus Christ." Then he saw the leather folio, tucked into one corner, bound by a strap surprisingly well preserved. He drew it out, brushing grit from its surface. His fingers recognized it instantly, a soldier's journal. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, but the ink faded, though it was remained legible. Across the inside flap, written in a careful slanted hand, were the words, "Captain Marcus Thornfield, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1876. Jack stared at the name until the letters blurred. Dusty shifted beside him, lowering his head as though peering at the pages too. Jack's hand trembled. He unbuckled the strap and began to read. The first entries were dry logistics dates, rations, marching orders. Mentions of their route from Fort Laramie escorting gold bound for Cheyenne. Nothing surprising until the tone shifted. June 12th, 1876. The men are uneasy. The desert is crueler than the Sioux. The heat blisters the skin and the water turns foul before we can drink it. I tell them to hold, that duty is heavier than hardship, but I feel their faith wearing thin. June 15th. Whispers in the night. Not of natives, of soldiers themselves. I saw Pike and Harlan speaking in low tones with strangers near the ridge. Traitors, they claimed. But no traitor wears a sidearm polished like that. I fear treachery. Yet if I accuse without proof, I may be the one overthrown. Jack turned pages, heart pounding. The writing grew more frantic. June 17th. It has happened. We were not ambushed by Indians. We were betrayed by our own. Men I trusted turned rifles on us, shouting orders not from me, but from another mouth. They said the gold belonged to them, that officers in Cheyenne would pay more than the army ever would. Gunfire tore through the camp. My faithful men fell where they stood. I led those who remained into the rocks, covering their retreat. We dragged the chest with us, swearing it would not fall into traitor hands. June 18th. We buried the gold beneath the mesa. The ground swallowed it like a grave. I swore we would return, but God knows if we ever can. The traitors hunt us still. I can hear their laughter in the wind at night. The final entry was a shaky scrawl blotched by water stains, or perhaps tears. June 20th. If these pages are found, let the truth be known. There was no Indian ambush. The lie was forged by those who killed us men, bought by greed and shielded by corrupt officers. Tell the world. Tell them we were not cowards, not deserters, but soldiers murdered for the price of gold. Do not let our names rot in silence. Empty Jack lowered the journal, the silence of the mesa pressing against him like a weight. He sat back on the sand, staring at the chest, the gold, the relics of lives cut short. His hands shook around the journal. He had worn the uniform once. He knew the bitter taste of betrayal, the way command could use a man's life like a pawn on a board. Reading Thornfield's words felt like reading his own wounds, written a century and a half earlier. Dusty stood close with the old horse's shadow falling across him. Jack lifted his eyes, and for one impossible moment, he felt they weren't alone. He imagined Thornfield himself standing there, hollow-eyed, waiting for someone to finally hear him. Jack whispered, "I hear you, Captain." Loud and clear. The wind had shifted. Jack Callahan felt it the moment he cinched the canvas satchel shut and slung it over his shoulder. The weight of Thornfield's journal pressed against his ribs, heavier than any bar of gold. He wiped grit from his forehead, slid the revolver back into its holster, and gave the chest one last look before pushing earth back over its edges. "Enough for today," he muttered. "We've stirred the dead plenty." Dusty waited nearby, head high, ears swiveling. The horse had grown restless the moment Jack sealed the satchel, pawing the ground, tail snapping. Jack frowned. Then he heard it too. At first, it was only a tremor, faint, distant, carried by the canyon walls. But it grew, a drumming, multiplied, overlapping. Hooves, not wild mustangs. Too many, too heavy. And then metal sharp and distinct. Spurs jangling, rifle barrels slapping against saddles. Jack froze, eyes narrowing toward the trail that led up into the mesa. A haze of dust was rising beyond the ridge. Sunlight turned it into a shifting veil, and within it moved dark silhouettes. Riders. "God damn it," Jack whispered. Dusty snorted, hard muscles bunching beneath his weathered hide. He pawed the dirt twice, stamping in agitation, then swung his head toward Jack as though urging him to mount. Jack's heart kicked. Whoever they were, they hadn't come by accident. The agents had spoken truth between their lies. Somebody was watching him, waiting for him to take the bait. Now they were here to collect. By the time Jack swung into the saddle, the riders had reached the mesa floor. 6, maybe 7 in all, dusty leather coats, hats, pulled low rifles slung across their backs, revolvers hanging at their hips. They fanned out in practiced formation, hooves pounding, dust curling around them like storm clouds. The leader pulled ahead, broad-shouldered, jaw like a slab of granite, eyes shaded but cold even at a distance. He reined in sharply, raising one gloved hand. The others slowed, spreading to form a crescent that sealed the only open trail down. Callahan, the man, barked his voice, carrying like a rifle crack. "Hand it over. Do that, and maybe you leave here breathing." Jack's pulse hammered. He slid his hand to his revolver, thumb brushing the worn checkering of the grip. He hadn't fired it in years, but he knew the weight, the balance, the way it pulled like a second heartbeat. He raised his voice steady as he could. "You're wasting your time. This doesn't belong to you." The leader's lip curled. "Neither does it belong to you." He jerked his chin. 2 of his men nudged their mounts forward, rifles lowering across their thighs. The air snapped, taut silence like a rope pulled tight. Dusty shifted beneath Jack, but did not shy. The horse's ears were locked forward, eyes blazing. A shot rang out, not at Jack, but into the dirt a few yards from Dusty's hooves. Stone splintered, sparks leapt. "Next one won't miss," the leader warned. Jack flinched, but held his ground. His knuckles whitened on the satchel strap. Then Dusty did something Jack hadn't expected. He wheeled sideways, pressing his flank against Jack's leg, hard enough to jolt him. Jack almost lost the reins, startled. The horse snorted, shook his head, then surged forward, not at the gunman, but toward the mesa's far wall, where cliffs loomed like prison bars. "Dusty, wait," Jack hissed. But the horse wasn't waiting. The mesa's far side was nothing but stone, sheer and jagged. Jack's stomach clenched as Dusty galloped straight toward it. "You're crazy, old boy. There's no way out that way." Dusty didn't slow. At the last possible moment, then the horse veered sharply right, plunging through a tangle of scrub and broken rock. Branches tore at Jack's sleeve, stung his face. Then suddenly the wall opened, a slit of a trail, narrow as a scar, cutting along the cliff face itself. Jack's breath caught. From a distance, it had looked like solid rock, but Dusty had known. The horse shouldered into the path without hesitation, hooves striking sparks on stone. To Jack's left, the cliff fell away into a gulf of empty air, hundreds of feet down. Wind screamed up from below, tearing at his hat, filling his ears with the roar of nothingness. Behind them came gunfire. Bullets clanged against rock, spat stone dust across his cheek. Jack ducked low over Dusty's neck, every muscle tense to iron. The riders gave chase. Their curses and shouts echoed in the canyon. But within a minute, the difference was clear. The ledge barely allowed one horse's width. Dusty navigated with uncanny surety, planting each hoof where the rock was soundest, hugging the inside wall. The others weren't so skilled. Jack risked a glance back. One rider pressed too far to the edge, his mount stumbled, hooves sliding on scree. The man cursed, yanked hard, barely saving himself from pitching over the side. Dusty surged on mane, whipping Jack's face. The trail dipped, curved, narrowed again. Jack couldn't breathe for fear. Every step was a gamble. If Dusty slipped even once, they'd fall into nothing. Steady, Jack whispered, half prayer, half command. Easy now, boy, easy. Dusty didn't falter. The old horse moved with the sureness of memory, as if he'd walked this path 100 times in another life. Rocks slid behind them, gunfire grew faint. The pursuers tried to follow, but their mounts balked at the narrowness, hooves scraping, riders swearing. One horse reared, nearly toppling backward into the man behind him. Jack caught the sound of Morrison's threat echoing in his mind. Cooperator vanish? Not today. Not while Dusty breathed. The trail twisted, dropping suddenly into a shadow defile between two sheer ridges. Darkness swallowed them for a dozen strides, their hoofbeats booming like war drums off the walls. Jack's lungs burned, heart slamming. He clutched the satchel tight against his chest, terrified the journal might spill into the void. Then light ahead. The path widened, the rock opening like a gate. Dusty burst from shadow into a narrow valley, the sky spreading wide above, streaked with late afternoon fire. The ground sloped steadily downward, gravel crunching beneath hooves. Jack risked another look back. Nothing. The gunmen were gone, their shouts smothered by distance and stone. The mesa had sealed them away. The landscape changed with every bend. The harsh flats of red sandstone and dust gave way to shadows where moss clung to damp rock. Jack blinked, adjusting to the sudden greenness. Somewhere ahead, the faint sound of trickling water reached him, delicate as a whisper. He frowned. He had ridden these mountains before in younger days, hunting elk or scouting fence lines. Never once had he stumbled across water here. This was a place of sunburnt stone and silence, not life. Yet the path widened and the world shifted. The cliffs opened to reveal a hidden hollow, lush, impossibly lush. A stream wound its way through grass that rippled like velvet under the breeze. Cottonwoods and pines mingled their shadows long in the sinking sun. Birds darted through the canopy, flashing color across the green. Jack reined Dusty to a halt, awestruck. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. It was a valley carved out of time itself, a sanctuary no map had ever shown. He had heard no word of such a place in Clearwater or anywhere else in Wyoming. It was as if the mountains had decided to keep this secret for themselves. Dusty tossed his head mane, glinting in the light, then stepped forward with calm certainty. Jack led him. The horse had saved his life twice now. If Dusty said there was a road, Jack would follow. At the far edge of the valley, half hidden among the trees, smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. Jack stiffened. There was a cabin, small, built from weathered logs, its roof sagging but intact. The porch boards were worn smooth, and the faint glow of firelight flickered behind the windows. Someone lived here. Dusty slowed and came to a stop at the foot of the porch. He let out a soft, almost reverent nicker. Jack's hand went instinctively to his revolver. The door creaked open. An old man stepped out into the evening light. He was tall, despite a stoop in his shoulders, his hair and beard white as ash, his eyes piercing beneath heavy brows. His movements were unhurried, measured. He did not look startled to see Jack. If anything, the sigh that escaped his lips carried the weight of long expectation. His gaze slid past Jack and fixed on Dusty. The old man's face softened. I knew this day would come, he murmured. Jack drew the revolver a fraction from its holster. Who the hell are you? The man raised one palm in peace. Not your enemy. My name is Silas Thornfield. The name struck Jack like a hammer. He froze, pulse racing. Thornfield. Inside the cabin smelled of pine resin and smoke. Books and papers lined the walls, maps tacked to beams, artifacts resting on shelves, buttons, buckles, rusted saber hilts. Jack's eyes darted from object to object, recognizing the same symbols he'd unearthed from the mesa soil. Silas poured steaming tea into mismatched cups and slid one across the table. You're Jack Callahan, he said without asking. A soldier once. A man who carries silence heavier than he carries words. Jack didn't touch the tea. His voice came rough. You said Thornfield. As in Marcus Thornfield, my grandfather, Silas replied quietly. Captain Marcus Thornfield, 7th Cavalry. The man who vanished in 1876. Jack felt the world tilt. The journal in his satchel seemed to burn against his ribs. Silas studied him with eyes that gleamed like firelight on steel. You found something, didn't you? Gold relics? A record. Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for him. Silas leaned back. I know because Dusty brought you here. Jack stiffened. Dusty Silas turned his gaze to the horse standing just outside the open door, his silvered mane stirring in the breeze. That horse, he said, his tone grave. That is no ordinary animal. He was my grandfather's mount. Jack barked a disbelieving laugh. That's impossible. He'd have to be over a century and a half old. Silas finished. Yes, I know. Jack's mouth went dry. He reached out, fingers brushing Dusty's mane where it fell through the doorway. The horse pressed gently into his palm, eyes dark and fathomless, older than they had any right to be. My family has lived in the shadow of Marcus Thornfield's disappearance, Silas went on. Some said betrayal, some said massacre. But one thing never changed. The horse returned. Jack's head snapped up. Returned, Silas nodded. When I was a boy, my father told me the stories. Dusty would vanish for years, decades sometimes, and then appear again when the family thought all was lost. He carried the weight of those soldiers who never came home. He is their witness, their keeper. Some of us called it a curse, others a blessing. I've come to think of it as both. Jack swallowed hard. You're saying this horse has lived since 1876? I'm saying he has never died, Silas said softly. And if he brought you here, it means he chose you. The time for silence is over. Jack sat back, stunned. The fire crackled. Outside, Dusty shifted his ears, tilting toward the sound of his name, as if acknowledging the truth. For a long time, neither man spoke. Jack stared into his untouched tea, trying to make sense of the impossible. He remembered the horse's unflinching eyes during the cliff escape, the way Dusty had guided him, as though retracing a path etched into memory. Silas finally broke the silence. Many men have tried to follow the trail of Marcus Thornfield's gold. Greed has driven them, but Dusty never led them here. You understand what that means? Jack met his gaze. Why me? Silas's expression softened. Because you're not driven by greed? You carry wounds that echo my grandfather's. Dusty sees it. He always sees. The words cut deep. Jack thought of his own service, the betrayal of promises, never kept comrades lost to orders that made no sense. He thought of how easily he could have become like those gunmen on the mesa, hungry, desperate, willing to kill for gold. Silas's voice hardened. But mark this, Callahan, once you hold the truth, you cannot return to ignorance. If you speak, the powers that buried Thornfield's company will rise against you. If you stay silent, you'll carry the weight alone as I have." Jack felt the satchel heavy at his side. The journal seemed to pulse with Marcus Thornfield's dying words. "Tell the world the truth. Do not let us be forgotten." The old man's warning lingered. Outside, the valley whispered with wind through grass, a paradise untouched. Yet even here, Jack felt the shadow of pursuit pressing at his back. Silas rose and stepped out onto the porch. He gazed toward the mountains where twilight gathered in violet folds. "They'll come," he said quietly. "They always do. But Dusty has brought you to the heart of the story. This isn't its end, it's the beginning." Jack followed him into the fading light. Dusty stood in the meadow mane silver against the fire of the setting sun. He lifted his head high, eyes gleaming with something that was no longer simply animal. It was as if the horse himself bore the memories of 150 years, the endurance of every man who had ever trusted him. Jack's breath caught. For the first time, he truly understood Dusty wasn't just a horse. He was a living testament, a bridge across time. And whatever came next, Jack Callahan knew his life would never again be his own. The night in the hidden valley had been both a balm and a torment. For the first time in days, Jack had lain down without the sound of boots or gunfire dogging his dreams. The cabin walls, though thin, felt like a shield against the endless pursuit. Silas had offered him a blanket tea that tasted faintly of sage and silence that spoke louder than any words. Dusty had grazed outside the cabin, calm as though he knew the valley belonged to him. But Jack did not sleep deeply. Every creak of timber, every whisper of the wind through pine needles felt charged with a warning. His mind kept circling back to the journal in his satchel. Marcus Thornfield's last words etched into fragile paper, and to the weight of the gold hidden under floorboards. Treasure was one thing. Truth was another. And the truth Jack knew was worth killing for. When dawn finally broke, pale light spilling across the ridge, Jack and Silas stepped out onto the porch together. The valley shimmered with dew, the stream glittering like spilled silver. For a brief moment, Jack almost believed they were safe. Then Dusty froze. The horse's ears shot forward, body taut. A low rumble passed through his chest before he reared, splitting the morning with a shrill, urgent neigh. Jack stiffened, hand flying to the revolver at his hip. Silas narrowed his eyes, scanning the ridge. That was when the sounds reached them, not just hoofbeats, but the grinding growl of an engine coughing as though half broken. Hooves and pistons together, an unholy chorus of centuries colliding. Dust and grit lifted beyond the tree line. Figures emerged. Jack's stomach sank. More than a dozen riders spilled from the trail, some on horseback, some crammed into the back of a battered pickup truck, rifles gleaming in the sun. Dusty pawed the ground and hissed through his nostrils. Jack recognized the cut of their coats, the swagger of their weapons. These were the same men who had tried to hem him in on the mesa, only now there were twice as many armed to the teeth, intent on finishing what they had started. Silas muttered, "So it begins." The mercenaries fanned out with chilling precision. Two vaulted from the truck bed, sliding behind boulders that ringed the valley like fortifications. Others dismounted boots, crunching in unison. Within moments, the cabin was surrounded every angle covered by rifle sights and cold, hungry eyes. A voice rang out harsh and commanding, "Callahan, you and the old man inside. Hand over the gold and the documents. Maybe we'll let you keep breathing." Jack leaned against the porch railing, revolver ready. He shouted back, "You want them? Come and take them." He squeezed off a warning shot, the bullet slamming into the bark of a cottonwood not 10 feet from where one gunman crouched. Splinters flew, The mercenary cursed and ducked lower. And then the valley erupted, rifles cracked bullets whistling into the cabin walls. Glass shattered shards scattering across the floorboards. The air filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder and the splintering shriek of timber. Jack dove through the doorway, slamming his shoulder against the wall as another round tore through where his chest had been a second earlier. Silas was already inside his weathered hands, calm and steady, as he slid the bolt on a long rifle that looked older than Jack himself. He fired through a narrow slit in the wall, one of several Jack now realized had been cut deliberately into the cabin logs. The shot rang true. A mercenary pitched sideways, his rifle clattering to the dirt. Silas reloaded before the man's body even hit the ground. First rule of survival. Silas said coolly, "Make the bastards think twice." Jack gritted his teeth and leaned out a shattered window revolver, barking 3 times in quick succession. Another attacker stumbled, clutching his thigh. For a moment, the pressure eased. But numbers weighed heavy. 10 against 2 was bad math in any battle. The cabin rattled as fresh rounds slammed into it, splinters raining down like hail. The porch roof sagged under the hail of bullets. Smoke curled from fresh cracks in the timber. "They'll burn us out if they can't shoot us out," Jack muttered. "Then we don't let them," Silas said grimly, chambering another round. Through the haze of battle, a sound cut different from the gunfire, Dusty's voice shrill and sharp. Jack risked a glance through the smoke and saw the horse circling near the porch hooves, striking earth with deliberate fury. At first, Jack thought Dusty was panicked, thrashing to escape. But no, there was rhythm in tension. The horse dragged his hoof across the ground, again and again, gouging lines into the dirt. Not random scrapes, but mark shapes. Jack blinked, heart hammering. Dusty's hooves traced a winding path, twisting across the soil until the grooves ended in a jagged mark like a cliff face. A map. The horse was drawing a damn map. Silas Jack shouted over the gunfire. "Look!" The old man stole a glance between volleys, his eyes lit with something fierce, almost reverent. "He's showing us the way." A bullet cracked through the doorway, sending wood flying. Jack ducked back, coughing on smoke. "He's telling us to move." But Silas didn't follow. Instead, he gave a slow, resolute shake of his head. "Not us, Callahan. You." Jack's gut clenched. "The hell are you talking about? We both go." 2 rifles are better than 1. Silas rammed a cartridge into the chamber with steady hands. His gaze was steady voice, calm despite the chaos battering the cabin. "I've lived my life under this shadow. My grandfather's disappearance, the silence, the unanswered questions. It's been my burden for 70 years. But Dusty chose you. You're the one meant to carry this truth out of here." Jack felt anger flare hot in his chest. "Don't do this, old man. You'll just be throwing your life away." Silas caught Jack's shoulder with surprising strength, his grip iron hard. "Listen to me. If we both die here, the truth dies too. My grandfather's words, those men's sacrifice, all for nothing. But if you ride out, if you bring the journal to light..." Then the silence breaks. His eyes burned with conviction. "That is my family's legacy. My duty is to buy you time." Outside, bullets tore fresh holes into the wall. Smoke thickened. The cabin groaned like a wounded beast. Jack's throat tightened. "Silas." The old man gave him a faint wry smile. "Don't waste it, soldier." Then he shoved Jack toward the rear door, barked "Go," and spun back to the window, rifle spitting fire. Jack stumbled, heart tearing in 2. He wanted to stay to fight shoulder to shoulder like the comrades he had once bled beside. But Silas's words echoed louder than the gunfire. "If we both die, the truth dies too." With trembling hands, Jack clutched the satchel tight against his chest. The rear door burst open beneath his weight. Cool mountain air rushed in, carrying the metallic tang of smoke. Dusty stood ready, muscles, taut eyes blazing with uncanny awareness. Jack vaulted into the saddle, one arm wrapped tight around the satchel. "Go, boy," he rasped. Dusty surged forward, hooves pounding against the earth. He cut straight toward the line he had scratched into the dirt earlier, veering into a narrow gap between jagged rocks. Gunfire crackled behind them, bullets sparking off stone, but Dusty moved like a creature possessed, every step unerring. Behind the cabin thundered with defiance. Silas's rifle barked again and again, his shouts mingling with the roar of the mercenaries. Then came the shudder of an explosion, wood splintering, fire licking skyward. Smoke billowed up black against the twilight. Jack twisted in the saddle for one last glimpse. Through the haze, he saw Silas silhouetted in the doorway, rifle braced, still firing, as flames licked the cabin around him. A lone figure holding back a tide. Jack's chest constricted until he could hardly breathe. His voice cracked as he whispered, "God damn you, Silas." Dusty never slowed. Even after the valley fell away behind them and the echo of rifle shots dwindled to a tired rattle, the old horse kept his shoulders set and his ears forward, threading the ravine, as if each boulder and shadow were an old acquaintance. Jack felt the journal thump against his ribs inside the satchel, and pressed his free hand there instinctively, as though he could steady the heartbeat of a dead man with the weight of a palm. The walls tightened until the sky was a narrow ribbon of light above them. Sage gave way to rock, gave way to dampness, and the smell of smoke finally thinned into raw mineral air. Dusty eased from a trot to a careful walk, testing each step before committing to it. The passage bent left, then right, then folded in on itself so sharply, Jack had to draw his knee up to keep his boot from scraping the stone. The world went dim. Jack slid the little flashlight from his pocket and thumbed it on. The beam knifed down a corridor of wet stone, glinting on tiny beads of moisture clinging to the walls. The light swept past something squared off beneath the grit, a rotten plank. Another, a few feet on. Then a run of them, short, evenly spaced, sat atop crushed gravel that had hardened with time. Ties, Jack breathed. He swung the light farther and caught a flash of brown-red iron gone to rust, half buried in silt and shale. Rails lay there like the bones of a buried skeleton, buckled and twisted where the mountain had shifted, swallowed by the tight throat of the cut. He let out a low whistle. "They started a spur up here," he said to the horse, because there was no one else to tell. Never finished it. 19th century ambition with 21st century bad luck. Dusty flicked an ear, but kept walking, hooves clicking in a crisp, measured rhythm that returned to them from the stone, like a second horse marching at their side. The flashlight's cone of brightness walked ahead of them, finding a fallen spike here, an old fish plate there, ghost hardware scattered in a place the sun forgot. The gunfire behind them faded to a murmur, then to nothing, and in its place rose the steady metronome of hoofbeats, tick-tock, tick-tock, until Jack felt as if he were riding inside a clock wound by another century. He reached forward and rubbed the base of Dusty's mane. "You knew this was here too." The words came out a cracked whisper, half awe, half accusation. "What are you, old boy?" Dusty's only answer was to keep going. They walked like that for what might have been 30 minutes or a lifetime. Time goes strange in a tunnel, until at last the darkness thinned. The beam of Jack's light grew pale against a promise ahead. He snapped the flashlight off and pocketed it. The world brightened shade by shade, then all at once the passage coughed them out into a cramped pocket of sky. They stumbled into a small bowl of a valley, a wind-scrubbed amphitheater with a ribbon of creek at its feet and a game trail worn into one bank. Beyond it, the ground, breast softened into open country. Far off the plains ran like a green-brown tide toward a saw-tooth horizon, and the air smelled of sun-warmed grass instead of gun smoke and pine. Jack twisted in the saddle and looked back the way they'd come. Over the ridges and folds of stone, a smear of gray rose into the clean afternoon smoke. It hunkered low, smeared thin by the wind, the kind of smoke you see when timber gives up the ghost. He felt the ache hit him in the sternum as if someone had laid an axe there. He didn't know if Silas was still alive in that valley of secrets. He didn't know if the old man had slipped down some other hidden escape route prepared by a soldier's son who had spent a lifetime studying every exit. He only knew the sound of the rifle in that doorway, the silhouette rimmed by flame, the deliberate, patient rhythm of a man buying time. Dusty stopped of his own accord and gave a small, throaty nicker. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even comfort. It sounded like acknowledgement, a simple yes to the ache in Jack's chest. Jack swallowed hard. "If you're alive," he said to the far ridge, to the ribbon of smoke thinning on the wind, "I'll find you. If you're not, I'll keep the promise. I swear it." They turned their backs on the mountains and picked their way along the game trail, then down the slope, where shale gave under Dusty's hooves and slid in whispering sheets. The narrow valley widened into an apron of rolling ground, cut by dry arroyos and cow paths. They moved until the rock lay behind them like a dream, and the world opened into the long, patient lines of the plains. Days folded into one another. Jack kept to gullies and fence lines, swapping the mountain's secrecy for the anonymity of distance. He rode at dawn and dusk, resting in thickets when the sun burned high, avoiding roads unless a crossing forced his hand. He counted horseshoe prints not their own and saw none. Once a hawk's shadow skimmed the dust beside them, a silent arrow shot by the sun. They skirted a handful of ranches. Jack slept short light, the revolver under his palm and the journal under his shirt. When the lights of town finally showed one evening, those stubborn yellow windows, he knew as well as the scar on his hand. He felt something unclench inside him that he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the mesa. Clearwater looked exactly as he had left it, and not at all the same. The same sagging awnings and peeling paint. The same handful of pickups angled along Main. A pair of kids on bikes sharing a soda and trying to look like they didn't care if they toppled. A stray dog nosing at a trash can and pretending it wasn't. But Jack moved down the street with a spine he hadn't had when he last came through this dust. He was still a broke rancher on the outside. On the inside, he carried an officer's dying request and a steel box of gold stamped with a government seal that had turned to rot. That made a man stand different. He swung down at the library steps. Dusty stood under the ironwork shade and lowered his head, as if he knew what was about to happen. Jack gripped the satchel and walked through doors that complained like old men asked to dance. Helen Moore looked up from behind the desk. For a second, her face didn't change. Then the light in her eyes sharpened, as if she'd found a word she'd been searching for over half a lifetime. "Jack," she said, "you look like you've ridden out of a storm." He crossed to the table they had used the last time, the wood now scarred with a half-century of elbows and ink pens. He set the satchel down and untied the knots with fingers that weren't as steady as he'd have liked. He laid the journal there, as if setting down a newborn. Then he eased out a leather pouch, spilled the gleam of gold enough to break a lifetime of cynicism, and added a single silver bracelet shaped by a hand that had lived and died long before Jack's grandfather got his first razor. "Satan take me," Helen whispered. And then, because she was who she was, she didn't reach for the gold. She reached for the journal. Jack's voice came rough, steadier as he spoke. "Keep it safe, all of it. As of now, only you know where this is." Helen looked up at him. "You understand what this could mean?" Jack nodded. I do. And I understand there are people who'll try to make sure it never means anything. Helen's mouth flattened into a line that would have made schoolchildren sit up straighter. Then we moved quickly. He left her with the journal, the bracelet wrapped in cloth, a single small bar of gold that would be proof to men who needed proof more than truth. He took the rest back with him, not because he wanted to keep it, but because he had learned in war and in life that there is safety in scattering your value. He stepped into the falling light. Dusty lifted his head and let a fly off his eyelid with a toss. People on the sidewalk watched him, some with the old amusement, some with a new-edged curiosity. Jack didn't notice. Or if he did, it slid off him like rain off a good slicker. He had work to do. He had a promise to keep. And he had a horse at his side who had outlived more secrets than the town had souls. It did not happen overnight. A truth that had been buried for 150 years does not simply climb onto a table and announce itself. But Helen Moore knew how to build a fire that would not blow out at the first gust. She began with a scan-gloved hands, camera notes in a precise hand that would have flattered the Army quartermaster who had once inventoried bayonets and flour in the year the ink dried. She called a man she trusted at a nearby university, and a woman in Laramie who had written papers about paper itself, watermarks, rag content, and the way iron gall ink ages the fibers it stains. She did it quiet, and she did it fast, and when she said the word confidential, people remembered why librarians are the last line between a story and a bonfire. They looked at the thread count of the paper. They looked at the way the capital letters were sloped in the hand of Marcus Thornfield, and found those same quirks in letters his brother had written from Boston, and a receipt with his name and commission rank tucked under glass in a museum case 3 counties over. They let the ink tell them how long it had lain, a century and a half of slow oxidation captured in the fibers, like weather in rings of a tree. They traced the cavalry insignia stamped faint on the inside cover and found that it matched a die used in 1875. Meanwhile, a historian with a nose for rot and an affection for dusty county records traced names Thornfield had written in his final pages, Pike and Harlan, and a captain with a smile too easy and a ledger too neat, and found their trails leading into suspicious resignations and convenient postings back east that hit the newspapers the week after Thornfield vanished. A second historian combed tribal archives and brought out a testimony written in careful English by a Cheyenne interpreter in 1877, stating plainly that there had been no attack on a cavalry camp near Clearwater that summer, though the tribe had carried anger enough to want one. After 3 weeks of this quiet, stubborn methodical, the circle around the truth had tightened until there was only one thing left to do: outtell it. The press release went out on a Tuesday, in the kind of clear weather journalists pray for. It said in the plain language honest people use when they are tired of pretending that a journal belonging to Captain Marcus Thornfield of the 7th Cavalry had been found and authenticated, that it stated he and his men had been attacked by mercenaries paid with army money at the behest of corrupt officials, and that, in the aftermath, a lie had been written in official ink and laid on the heads of people who had not done the killing. Newspapers that had been printing the same 3 dull stories all month finally had a headline with teeth. 150 years later, the ambush that wasn't. Missing Cavalry Journal exposes 1876 cover-up. Truth exonerates Native community in Wyoming mystery. The editorials came fast, some angry, some weeping, some carefully dignified, because dignified men do not like to admit they were wrong for a century and a half. They came to Clearwater as they always do, cameras like black eyes and microphones like questions you cannot dodge. Helen wore her good sweater and spoke as if she were explaining decimals to a room full of 10-year-olds, which in a way she was. She said the word evidence a lot. She used dates. She did not say "I told you so" because she was not that kind of woman. They found Jack too. He stood on the library steps with Dusty tied to the rail and said, "I followed a horse." And then, because the eyebrows went up, he added, "Sometimes the only thing a man can do is not look away when he's shown something." He said it once and refused to say it again. They made his one sentence into 300 words because that's what they do, and if he read them, he did not let it show. A van from a station with a slick logo drove out to a reservation 2 hours away and spoke to an elder who had the patience of sandstone. He said there had always been a story in his community that the cavalry had not died by Cheyenne hands, and that truth coming late is still truth. A woman cried on camera not because of the gold or the soldiers, but because her great-great-grandfather's name had been used like a weapon in a lie. Then she stopped crying and said they would like a monument that told it right. You can't unring a bell. You can't put the smoke back in the chimney after the house is burned. Men whose grandfathers' portraits hung in state offices did some quiet calls and deleted some emails and chose not to drive out to Clearwater and stand on those steps. By the end of the month, there was money on a table that had never been on a table for anything but road repairs and campaign diners. Some of it came from the State House, some from universities that liked to sponsor truth when truth had a good press kit, some from quiet donors who had read the story at breakfast and felt the right kind of shame. They called it the Thornfield Foundation, which was tidy and proper, and they decided it would fund research into the kinds of land deals and treaty swindles that had rolled like a slow wave across the West, and it would pay for plaques that said what really happened, and it would gather school children in rooms so they could hold buttons and coins and feel the weight of a story that didn't belong to Hollywood. They held a ceremony on the courthouse lawn because every American story gets a courthouse at some point. There were folding chairs and a podium and a banner with the foundation's name printed on it, and the sheriff sweating through his uniform because no one had told him to take the dark shirt off in July. Helen got a plaque that said "For service to history," and she received it with her chin up and her eyes shining and her hand not shaking even a little. She looked down from the podium and saw Jack in the shadows thrown by the cottonwoods, and she gave him the smallest nod in the world. He nodded back. He did not like crowds. He did not like speeches. But when the applause rose and then thinned, he felt something he had not felt since before the war relief that did not carry a debt. Out at Broken Spur Ranch, a hammer fell where the roof used to leak, and a new board took the nail. The plumber from 2 towns over replaced pipe that had been doing its best against chemistry since Truman, and the well water ran clear with a sweetness you only taste when you didn't have it before. Jack strung new wire where the fence had slumped and walked the line, with Dusty ghosting him on the other side of the posts. He did the work measuring both the bills he paid and the gold he kept, and found that if a man stops trying to look rich, he can afford to be honest. Ethan Crowley drove by one afternoon in a truck so clean you could have shaved in the reflection of the hood. He stopped, tapped a knuckle on the window, and leaned out with a look that tried for careless and landed somewhere near respectful. "Looks good," he said, tone neutral as Wyoming sky. "Guess that old horse was a better investment than I thought." Jack let the corner of his mouth bend. "Guess so." Ethan looked like he wanted to say 3 other things and couldn't find a way to push any of them out without losing face in his own mirror. He settled for a nod and rolled on. Sometimes that's as close as apologies get. Dusty changed, and he didn't. He slept more sometimes, dropping his head and drifting in the doorway of the barn, as if he were standing watch in a friendly outpost at last. He moved slower when the mornings were cold. The silver in his mane went from suggestion to fact, a flag of surrender to time that somehow felt like a victory, and yet his eyes stayed lit from inside. And when Jack ran his palm down the furrow between Dusty's ears, the horse leaned into it so deliberately you could almost hear him say, "Still here." On quiet evenings, Jack pulled a kitchen chair out onto the porch and sat with his boots crossed at the ankles while the sun did its slow, decent thing with the sky. Sometimes he spoke aloud, even if no one was there to hear it, and sometimes the words were just shapes he formed with his mouth and didn't breathe. "Thank you," he said more than once, "for choosing me." Dusty would lift his head in the pasture and flick an ear as if a man could send gratitude through air, like radio, and maybe he could. On the morning that felt like an ending and a beginning, without trying to be either, Jack poured coffee into the mug with the chipped rim and looked out over a ranch that was still small and still humble and finally whole. He remembered the auction yard when this had all begun, the way the dust had climbed into the sun like a curse. The way men had laughed, because laughing at another man's bad bet makes you feel rich for 5 minutes. $50 had left his hand, because he couldn't bear to watch something be thrown away that still had dignity left in it. He thought of that $50 now and felt the grin start in his chest and work upward. Sometimes the smallest kind of courage is the one that turns the key. From the yard came a soft, familiar sound, Dusty nickering low in his throat, as if he had remembered the same morning. Jack raised the mug in salute, like you do for men who can't drink anymore, and then, because it was too good not to do, he said, "Here's to the dead who didn't get to tell their own story. And here's to the horse that carried it for them." He sat a long while after the coffee was gone, watching the mountains turn from blue to bright. Somewhere up there, a valley wore the smoke scent of sacrifice into its soil, and a cabin might be a black scar or might be a memory burned without trace. If Silas Thornfield had found another hole in the rock and walked out of it into air as clean as a hymn, Jack would see him again. If not, he would still see him on paper and plaque, and a name on a foundation letterhead that would pay to teach a child what truth costs and what it buys. When the sun was fully up, Jack stood and stretched and snapped the reins lightly on his thigh as if to test the sound. Dusty lifted his head and took a step toward the gate. "Work to do," Jack said, and he was smiling when he said it. The mountains kept their shape, which is not to say they kept their secrets. Some secrets had walked down out of them and into daylight, wearing paper and ink and the stubborn hoofprints of a horse that would not lie down until the story was carried the last mile. And if there were more secrets up there, and there are always more, Jack could live with that. Because some mornings you look toward the ridgeline and know as surely as you know your own name that endings and beginnings are a matter of where you stand when you start walking.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.